Let's suppose that you're producing a P sound, as in pin. Let's suppose that you produce it on another day and you're feeling not so good, and you don't put quite the same amount of energy behind the release of your P sound, and it is a little less emphatic. So instead of saying pin, you say pin. And let's suppose you've got a cold and you say pin. Well, they are P sounds, but they're not exactly the same. But for the English language, they are the same. In this section, we're dealing with one of the most interesting and significant concepts in linguistics, but it also relates to a lot of other ways in which humans perceive things. We have the capacity to perceive things as being both the same and different at the same time. Let's just have a look at the little diagram that you're looking at now, the little picture. You'll see that there are two trees in this picture. Are the trees the same? Well, not exactly. Are they both trees? Oh, the answer is yes, they are. What about the clouds in the middle of the picture? Well, one's a very big cloud and one's a little cloud, but of course they're both clouds. And the stylized people that are behind the text, yes, they represent people, but none of them is exactly the same. Speech sounds are in some ways exactly like that. Although we are producing them and they may be different, nevertheless, quite often that difference makes no difference. We hear them as being the same. We're now starting to look, instead of looking at speech sounds from the producer's point of view, we're starting to look at them from the language's point of view. Because for the English language, it doesn't matter whether you've got a cold or whether you're feeling out of sorts, so long as for the English language you're producing a P sound that is in some crucial sense the same as P sounds are for all the other speakers of English. So let's try a little exercise that illustrates this rather well. What I want you to do is to try and listen very carefully to the sounds that you're going to produce yourself and ask yourself, are they the same or are they actually different? Let's listen to the T sound in still, 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 still. It has an onset and a hold time and a release. It's a voiceless alveolar stop. Now let's try it again in the word till. Till. I want you to put the back of your hand up in front of your mouth as you're producing it and go till. And now compare that with still. Hey, notice that when you produce the T in still, there's no big puff of air, whereas when you produce the T in till, there's a big puff of air and you can feel it on the back of your hand. So, are these sounds being produced in the same way? Well, yes, but also no. There is a difference. What about the T in little? Little. Think of the release for a moment. How are you releasing this T sound? The onset is the same. T, t, right? The tongue goes up on the alveolar ridge. There's a hold time. The release, however, is not done by opening your mouth by lowering your tongue. T. What you're doing is lowering only the sides of your tongue. Little, tl. The release is not a total release, it's a release round the side only. This is a lateral release. What about the T in button said normally? Button, button. Here, the T is not released orally at all. But what you do is you lower your velum or soft palate and you release it through the nose. You can actually tell that again by closing your nostrils with your thumb and forefinger. But, oh yes, if you do that, you will see that there is a full oral stop which doesn't get released except nasally. Are these T sounds produced in exactly the same way in each word? And the answer is no, they're not. In the first case, there's no puff of air. In the second case, there is a puff of air. In the third case, the T is released as a lateral. And in the fourth case, the T is released nasally. So there are quite significant differences. Are all these T sounds? Yes, indeed they are. We now introduce something of a variation, and you'll notice in the title bar I've put the T in slashes. This is not the T sound you actually produce. This is the T sound as in the English T sound. What's the same about all of these T sounds and what's different? Well, what's the same is all three of them, well, four actually, and there are numerous others. All these T sounds are voiceless alveolar stops. What's different is only the release. Do native speakers regard these differences as significant? Certainly not. In fact, while they obviously hear them, they don't perceive them as being significant. Just as for identifying the trees in the picture on the title page, we don't regard the slight differences in size and shape as different. They're trees, full stop, they're trees. Well, we now have to move from talking about phonetics, the actual business of producing speech sounds, to phonemes, the contrastive units in a language. Every language uses contrastive units, and these have been called phonemes for some time, for 100 years anyway. When you speak, the actual sounds that come out of your mouth are not phonemes. This is an odd thing. What actually comes out of your mouth is phonetics, actual speech sounds, real sounds. What you perceive when you hear them, and they are the sounds of your language, are phonemes. In a language you don't know, you can't perceive phonemes at all. You don't know what they are, all you hear is phonetics. Think of a time when maybe you've been on a public transport, on a bus or a tram or a train, and you've heard people speaking behind you, beside you, in a language other than your own. You don't hear any phonemes. You don't know the language. You don't know which of those sounds is contrastive, which of them is significant or not. Phonemes are essentially perceptual, and in order to perceive them, you must know the language. Only the language can tell you which sounds are significant and which ones aren't. And if you don't know the language, then you can't have those perceptions. Well, what do we do with all the various pronunciations of a phoneme? Well, we have to have a term for those. We call them allophones. We might have one phoneme, the phoneme T, with a whole bunch of different pronunciations, some with a puff of air after them, some without a puff of air, some released laterally, some released nasally. All those are allophones. Phonemes have allophones. And if you want to think of it this way, phonemes are realizations, ways of making real a phoneme in sound. What is actually a unit of perception in your head is realized as a particular sound, a particular allophone in a particular situation. So if we think of the T as having a little H behind it, a puff of air, as in team, with the puff of air being able to be felt on the back of your hand, then the allophone T with the little raised H is a realization of the phoneme T in the word team. Let's look at an analogy briefly. This is the letter T. There it is. What makes it a T? Well, it has an upward stroke. The upward stroke has to be longer than the cross stroke. The cross stroke has to be above halfway, and that's about it. Does it have to have a little curl at the bottom? Well, no. Can it be outlined? Well, yes. Are these the same? Yes, they're certainly the same in some respects. Generally, perceptually, we have the long stroke and the little stroke more than halfway up, but they're quite different. One is merely an outline and the other's all black. What about this one? Oh, it's a little longer and a little thinner. What about that one? It's an italic one. It's bent over. How far can we bend over a T and it still be a T? Well, a certain distance, but if you bend it over 45 degrees, have you still got a T? What about 90 degrees? Probably not. Are they the same? Oops, and this is just a tiny little shadow of a T. Are they the same letter? Yes, they're all the letter T, but they're all different as well. These are allo letters, if you like, of the letter T. So there is a generalized letter T. None of these in particular are that letter. All of them in general are. The long downward stroke with the little cross stroke, that's it. But that's quite abstract, really. These are allo letters rather than being the letter itself. Well, phonemes are like that. Phonemes are abstract. They exist in your head. They are perceptual units, but when you actually speak, you come out with a particular variant of that, a particular realization of it, depending on the context and whether you've got a cold or not.